You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your libido host, Abraham.
And I'm your non-existent host, Shane.
Oh, bummer.
Yeah, we'll say that. I know. Surprise. Okay. Ooh, I'm a ghost.
It's just me talking to a reflection of myself on the other side of the country.
Which means you're not a vampire.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's a good point. We are actually a psychology podcast. We talk about all of the things that people do, and sometimes, maybe for a long time, we talk about various dependencies that people may have or aspects of dependency and addiction. That's currently where we find ourselves in the middle of a suite of episodes dedicated to that very topic.
Yes. So today we are talking about sex addiction. And I think this is something that is, I'm going to say right now, I think the label is very charged.
Sure.
And I think that in the United States, sex is very confusing.
Also fair.
And this is going to be one of those topics that as we unpack it, you're going to go, huh, okay.
This is my favorite kind.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And there's a lot of people that have a lot to say about it that don't know what they're talking about. So that's fun too.
Okay. Well, that is a great setup and intro for this very, I think, provocative discussion that we are about to have. And if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. We're so happy to have you here. And although, as I said, we are in the middle of several episodes dedicated to the topic of addiction, we really did specifically design and have in mind that each of these would stand on their own. Now, I think that I've been really pleased with how they've turned out so far. So I do think that it would be worth checking out those episodes, but you really don't need them to be able to follow along with any of the discussions that we're going to have today or hereafter. Anyway, so welcome. Thank you for being here. If you do like what you hear today and you would like to support us and you haven't already, then you can pick up some merch. You can join us on Patreon. You can leave us a rating and review. Share us with a friend. Maybe you can make up a different type of addiction and call it Why We Do What We Do. Don't do that. I'll talk about all the ways that you can support us at the end of this discussion. In the meantime, we have to acknowledge that it is May 1st, which means Happy May Day.
Yay! It's also Agriculture and Labor Day.
And Couple Appreciation Day.
It is also Frequent Flyer Day.
The opposite of that, it is Global Love Day.
One of my favorite holidays is the Great American Grump Out.
I'm curious to know more.
Just be grumpy.
Okay, fair. It is International Sunflower Guerrilla Gardening Day. And guerrilla in this case meaning just sort of go out and plant sunflowers on random places, unasked and unwanted.
Uh-huh. Yes. Grow them up. I love it. It's Learn to Ride a Bike Day.
Love that. It is National Black Barbershop Appreciation Day. Fantastic.
Love it.
Feels like that should be in February, but I'm good with it here.
I'm good with it here too. It's National Chocolate Parfait Day.
It is National Infertility Survival Day. Have you survived being infertile?
There you go.
So it's your day.
Yeah, today's your day. It's National Interpreter Appreciation Day, which, I love interpreters, especially sign language interpreters.
Oh, yeah. They're so much fun to watch.
Oh, my God. They're so much fun to watch. I had a learner one time that I worked with who would call his girlfriend and they would have phone sex using a video interpreter. And that is probably one of my favorite things that I ever thought about. Like that there had to be an interpreter that would go back and forth and interpret the raunchy things they would say to one another. It's so great.
That's so relevant to today's topic as well.
Yes, it is.
And sort of relatedly, I guess, it is Choose Privacy Week.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess depending on what your kink or your fetish is, it's Go Diaper Free Week, too.
That's pretty good. All right. It is International Mariachi Week.
Love that. For that one, go listen to the band El Mariachi, if you'd like, or listen to an authentic mariachi band. But El Mariachi, if you like the Bronx, it's just Bronx El Mariachi. It is National Auctioneers Week. Sorry, Auctioneers Week.
Right. National Small Business Week.
And then it's also Jewish American Heritage Month.
Ooh, that's a loaded situation right now, I would say.
Yeah.
Given what's going on with the world. It is Global Employee Health and Fitness Month. I dig that.
Yes. And it is National Foster Care Month.
Ooh, love that.
Love our foster care folks that are doing good job out there,
That is so good. I'm so all for that. Now, we like to share these holidays because every day is just packed with some kind of thing to acknowledge and celebrate, and some people are really into that thing, and it's fun, I think, to share that. So we do that at the front of these discussions, but it's not what we're up to today, and not at least primarily. What we are talking about, as we said, is sex addiction, sexual addiction, probably just sex addiction. And it's important, I think, to couch this inside of the fact that so far when we've been talking about addiction in these various episodes, we have pretty much focused it almost entirely on chemical dependencies. We've talked about alcohol, we've talked about various other drugs and harm reduction, heroin and cocaine, and the war on drugs. A lot has been focused on chemical substance type addictions and dependencies that exist. And now we're starting our foray in a little bit. We're not going to go too heavy into this, I don't think, but there are a lot of things to talk about inside of behavioral addictions.
Yes. And so today we're going to specifically focus on sexual behavior and what that looks like, which we already know that sexual behavior is very complex. I do want to share a quick, just kind of a fair content warning, maybe not necessarily a trigger warning. There are going to be some discussions on just kind of the general idea of trauma related or abuse and neglect stuff that happens inside of this, maybe some sexual assault stuff. We're not going to go into details on what those things are, but we are going to, those terms are going to come up. So we just want to kind of give a fair content warning around that.
Oh, I'm so glad you said something. Yeah, that's a really good point. Some of this is going to be, if you're in the space of being sensitive to those kinds of discussions, that will be at least part of today's. As you said, we're not planning on going into the gruesome details, but we will be touching on those topics, just so people know. If you find that that's something that you are not comfortable listening to, or the people that you're around, maybe small children, it's possible that that will be something you would want them to hear. So just keep that in mind as you're making your decision moving into this. But as I said, the behavioral addiction piece of this is, I think it's interesting because whereas the others, I think most people understand and have at least some kind of empathy toward chemical addiction because it creates, I think, a feeling of necessity that seems inescapably out of control for the person who is using that substance. And behavioral addictions, they don't create noticeably the same kind of chemical withdrawal that I think a lot of people expect to see in spaces around chemical type addictions. And so instead, with behavioral addictions, you're looking at more things that are patterns and habits of behavior that are happening at such intensity and frequency that they result in harm and persist despite that harm, presumably.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about what a sexual addiction is, according to the current research, the current field, current practices around this specific topic. So when I say sexual addiction, I am referring to what is described as, quote, excessive sexual thoughts, desires, urges, or behaviors that can't be controlled and cause distress and harm to your relationships, finances, and other aspects of your life, end quote. Sometimes it's referred to as hypersexuality, compulsive sexual behavior, sexual dependency, etc., etc., etc. But the thing is what we just described kind of aligns with what we've talked about so far with addictions in general, right?
Right, yeah.
Distress, harm, and it kind of impacts these other areas of your life in some way.
Yes. And I think one of the other things that's interesting about this behavioral addiction and others is I think you could sort of group them into camps of like behavioral addictions of things that are necessary but are done to excess and things that are unnecessary and not harmful unless done to excess. And so like, for example, eating and sex, I think are things that are necessary and can be done to excess. And then things like gambling and social media and video games are things that are not inherently harmful, but are also not necessary and can be done to excess. And so a key characteristic described by many sources with sex addiction primarily focuses on the sort of compulsive engagement in sexual activity, this inability to control one's will to decide not to engage in this. And it's mostly sexual intercourse. It's basically the focus on this and the negative consequences of this heightened sort of, as you had mentioned, hypersexuality.
Right. Absolutely. So just to kind of provide a little bit of clarity on the topic, there is no formal diagnosis for sex addiction. Like, you're not going to find it like there's substance abuse disorders and stuff like that.
That's important.
Yeah, that's really important.
That's kind of huge, actually.
That's actually kind of the biggest thing that we're going to unpack. And we're going to kind of unpack why there isn't, but it is important to note that as of right now, at the time of this recording, the ICD-11 diagnostic criterion around this includes something called compulsive sexual behavior disorder. I want to point out that it is only the ICD-11 and no other diagnostic manual that has this specific thing in here. What's interesting about this is it's classified as a behavioral disorder. It's not actually described using an addiction model inside of the ICD-11. So there is no addiction kind of overlay with it inside of that manual.
So I think the way that I'm interpreting this, and correct me if I'm wrong then, is to say that like this calling something a sexual addiction, there doesn't seem to be support from the national or international psychological community that the addiction framework is appropriate for contextualizing sexual behavior of this nature. Does that sound right?
So yes to that. Okay. And there is just very little agreement on specifically what this looks like or what it entails.
Okay, got you.
Yeah, so like there's not really a good model to apply to it. And really what you're going to find is that a lot of it is actually kind of a brief spoiler here. A lot of times like hypersexualization might be the result of other mental health things going on.
Yeah, I could see that.
And might also be a self-medicating coping skill. So we're going to kind of unpack all that as we go. It's not likely that it's an actual addiction in and of itself.
Okay, I think that is a very important piece of this then. All right, so then let's talk about the ICD's compulsive sexual behavior disorder. So this is characterized by a persistent pattern of failure to control intense, repetitive sexual impulses or urges, resulting in repetitive sexual behavior. And I think in this case, the repetitive means at a rate higher than would maybe be considered an appropriately adaptive level.
Oh man, if that isn't vague, I don't know what it is. So there's also a pattern of failure to control intense sexual impulses or urges and resulting in repetitive sexual behavior, and that's manifested over an extended period of time for 6 months or more.
And then there are causes of marked distress or significant impairment in personal, family, social, educational, and then any other areas of sort of typical functioning and daily activity, if you will.
And in the distress that is entirely related to moral judgments and disapproval about sexual impulses, urges, or behaviors is not sufficient to meet this requirement. So just because you're having some distress about like, oh, I don't like this is uncomfortable, morally this is wrong, that's not part of this issue. So it's actually kind of like the repetitive engagement that's impacting your life. Now, that being said, I want to kind of point this out too. When you look at a lot of diagnostic criterion, they're going to have similar criteria. Right?
Right. Definitely.
Pattern of behavior that manifests over a period of time that causes distress. That is, in and of itself, kind of the blanket definition of mental health disorders as we go. Like those criteria meet almost every diagnosis that we talk about.
Right.
That is depression. That is bipolar disorder. That is anxiety. That is OCD. All of those things have similar criterion to that.
Even autism, even those diagnoses have the
traumatic
sort of rule in criteria. And it's actually funny as you say that, because I was looking at this and I always like to try and specifically pick apart definitions in criteria like these, because it's so important to consider what does it rule in, what does it rule out, what does it maybe include that it's not trying to include? Because I look at this list and I think I could quite easily point to a sex worker, maybe someone who performs in pornography or someone who works in like a sex work space where they're actively taking on clients. And like this meets the definition of their behavior. And I don't think that we would say that they have a compulsive sexual behavior disorder.
Right.
But they do have like a persistent pattern of there's a lot of repetitive sex going on. And it happens, if you were to just look at the frequency and rate of it, I think it definitely happens at a rate that it looks compulsive, even though I'm not necessarily sure you would describe it that way. And maybe it is though. Maybe they do. I don't know. So I think it's just worth considering. I'm not sure that this adequately rules out situations where there are external like motivation, I guess is where I was going with this.
And I think, when you start getting into stuff, when it talks about a marked distress or significant impairment in these other areas, I think there is a line where it starts to kind of reach that for some folks. Like,
Sure.
I know that when they talk about that with like pornography addiction, there's a point where it's like costing people their jobs because they can't stop accessing it and stuff like that. But I think ultimately what we're going to find is like, on the surface and kind of like as a general rule, this compulsive sexual behavior disorder is also not something that exists in any other diagnostic manual except for the ICD-9.
Right.
Because as we kind of start to go through the history and kind of where this stuff comes from, you're going to start discovering that like, oh, maybe this isn't as bad as everybody thinks it is.
Yeah. And actually, now that you did sort of raise a point in that I think is important, is that I do think that most sex workers, and I don't know, I haven't inventoried them, but I'm not sure that I would say that they say that it causes them marked distress or significant impairment. It probably does make certain social activities more challenging, depending on the kind of circles they're running in. When someone asks, what do you do for work? Which I think is an extremely common small talk type of question to ask.
Yeah.
That someone who is in that space, if they don't know you especially, they're not likely to say like, oh yeah, I'm a sex worker. I mean, maybe they are. I think it depends on where they come from on that. But I think they tend to not want to share that part of themselves because I think, and more or less, we live in a culture that has punished that type of even reporting, let alone action. So, anyway, a thing to consider as far as that.
Yeah. I mean, could you imagine being in a space where like somebody asked you what you did for work and like you either had to tell them that you were a sex worker or that you were doing ads?
All right, so we are back, and to answer your question, I think I would rather say that I was a sex worker. So anyway,
same.
Let's get into some history here about this, I guess, condition, since it's not a diagnosis, this condition of sex addiction and where that term even comes from.
Let's unpack this a little bit because I think, and I'm so glad that we did some of the like kind of like the episodes that we've done in this suite earlier because it all comes back, right? So the term sex addiction actually began to emerge in the mid 1970s as like an official like kind of like problem. And it actually came from none other than our friends in Alcoholics Anonymous.
Sure.
So they actually started looking at the applications of the 12-step program. Members of AA specifically began to look at applications of the 12-step program and aim to apply those strategies to folks who engage in serial infidelity and other unmanageable compulsive sexual behavior.
Oh no.
So that's kind of where it started. I know. They went 12 steps, but here instead. And so they actually created some other groups around this that were similar to AA. So there's Sex Addicts Anonymous, there's Sexaholics Anonymous, there's Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, and there's Sexual Compulsives Anonymous, just to name a few.
Do you know if all of those have the same sort of religious background and orientation to Alcoholics Anonymous?
I didn't do a deep dive on them. I would imagine that at least some of them do.
Okay. I definitely did not know how pressing it was for us to begin with our discussion on Alcoholics Anonymous at the beginning of this suite of episodes. So if you are interested, if you haven't already listened to that one, I recommend going back and checking it out because it has come up multiple times now, and it seems like it's likely to come up again.
Yeah. Isn't that funny?
Yeah, that's good to know. Much of the discussion around sex addiction was further conflated during the 1980s, because remember, this was sort of starting in the 1970s. So in the 1980s, This is getting conflated with cultural anxieties and tensions, and this sort of evoked this response of this moral concern and a movement to medicalize the disease and move toward the medical treatment model. And again, we've talked about in previous episodes about, I guess, talking about addiction as a disease. So worth, again, also revisiting that. I didn't think that we'd do this much back referencing, but point being, it doesn't really matter. You can go back and check it out. I think it's a good episode if you haven't heard it yet. But I think just the point being that like around the 80s is when we get this move to let's call anything that we are putting in the sphere of addiction a disease. And that really did come from the Alcoholics Anonymous sort of orientation.
Yeah, I mean, that really kind of changed the entire way that we look at this, or at least people look at this in the United States. But, as we go, you'll see kind of as we unpack more. So now a quote from Ray Atwood and Gooder in 2012. There was a book that kind of talked about sexual addiction and stuff, but this specific quote was pulled from this book. And it said, quote, "Though it is essentially mythical, creating a problem that need not exist, sex addiction has to be taken seriously as a phenomenon. Rarely has a socio-psychological discourse taken such a hold on the public imagination and proven an influential concept in academic circles too, end quote. And so basically what they're saying is that even if sex addiction is a mythical thing that does not exist, the conversation around it has become of such social importance that we have to study the phenomenon. We have to start looking at this from some way. And this kind of happens all the time. Some fad thing will come up and scientists have to study this, or, something has become kind of taken hold of the public. And now we've got to kind of spend some time studying it in the space of like debunking it and demystifying it and doing those things too. And that's kind of what happened here is people were really upset by this thing. And so,
and very worried about it.
And very, very, very worried about it, especially in the 80s when you started seeing HIV and AIDS start to rise and some of the stuff that goes along with that. You see this kind of worry around sexual behavior, and that's kind of always been the case in the United States. And so it makes sense that it turned into this kind of mythical problem that has turned into an industry around trying to cure sexual addiction,
It makes me think of and sort of reminds me of like flat earthers. I'm like, the earth isn't flat, but it's interesting to figure out exactly what kind of brain damage leads to you believing that the earth is flat. Like at what point along your developmental trajectory does logic just break down and all of a sudden you can sort of do mental gymnastics to make that nonsense cohere in your language.
Right.
And so it's sort of like, it is interesting to study, even if it's nonsense, because there's a contingent of people for whom this has been affected. Anyway, I don't want to compare sex addiction to flat earthers. Obviously, flat earthers is way further on the spectrum of like, this is nonsense.
Right.
Matter of fact, almost the archetype of like, how wrong can you be? Let's start it at flat earth.
Yeah.
So as you said, there are these detractors that argue that it doesn't exist. John Money, quoted in the book Sex Addiction, A Critical History, is quoted as saying, quote, "Sexual addiction is a newly coined term for a disorder as fictitious as thirst addiction, hunger addiction, or reading addiction. Sexual addictionology does not address the specificity of addiction. Instead, it decrees that the only non-addictive form of sexual expression is a lifelong heterosexual fidelity and commitment in a monogamous marriage," end quote. Wow. That is, I mean, it's not that I'm taking a firm stance on this right now, but it's not the first time that some standard in the United States that is sort of referred to as normal, expected, appropriate, has been linked to like a very specific sort of white cisgender heterosexual platonic orientation to the world as being the right orientation to the world. So drawing that parallel is immediately concerning.
And you're going to find as we go through this, a lot of the quote unquote problems that come up in sex addiction are absolutely because there's a comparison to heteronormative viewpoints of the world. But I want to take a little side quest here because we mentioned this man. His name is John Money.
Yeah,
okay.
I was going to ask about this.
Yeah. So who is John Money? Listeners, you may ask, he might sound like a porn star. That is a 100% porn star name. But he was a New Zealand American psychologist and a sexologist. He was also responsible for coining the terms gender role and sexual orientation. Now, to be clear, he did not coin the term gender identity. Okay. Because he's actually kind of an enemy to the trans community. Ooh. He was an advocate for what he called surgical normalization of genitalia of intersex infants. Because he believed in the first 2 years that gender was still kind of, which is like, this is like a weird roundabout way to get to where he got. He was like, God, gender is fluid, but only the first 2 years. So you can actually reassign people before they turn 2. Like, so he had kind of like the idea of gender fluidity, but like totally used it for nefarious purposes, right?
Yeah.
That's not the only problematic thing he's done as far as like gender identity and stuff. So he's kind of an enemy of the trans community for a lot of reasons. But it's just one of those things where, and I actually have noticed this quite a bit. This is totally anecdotal, that when you start getting into the sex education, sexology community, there are still a lot of really complex, really challenging debates around it, which, you know, shouldn't be as much of a debate as I think it is. But like, you have these people who are on these kind of like these camps that are like non-trans, that are non-homosexual, like all of this stuff that still exists inside this place that's supposed to be sex positive. It's really fascinating to see that kind of come up and go, oh man, we have got so much further to go on this. I mean, more than people realize. Even inside of the communities, they're supposed to be like the supportive communities.
It does speak to a bit the fact that this is very, very new. I think that people have been aware of and struggling with addictions like alcohol for about as long as we've had alcohol, which seems to be about as long as we've had any kind of civilization at all, like even like tribes. It seems like any other natural drug that even could be the case, that like people who have struggled with excessive use of those drugs. Right. This seems to have popped up within the last century. And presumably, as far as I know, human beings have been having sex for longer than that.
As far as I can tell.
Yeah, I think, citation needed, but as far as I know, that it has been going on for some time. So if it's just emerging, that would be surprising, particularly given that the actual practice of monogamy is also like probably on the newer end of things. Mm-hmm. So anyway, we'll talk about this. So let's talk about some types of sex addictions, because I think part of where people might have some but or even just no, you're wrong, because they might be thinking about, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And they'll have all these examples of like, what about people who have these impulses toward the various fetishes and family members or something, something where it's obviously very problematic for various reasons. Sure. What about those?
I just want to do a quick note as we go through this section. I went through website after website after website to try to find anything scientific on whether there were actual types of sexual addiction. What I found was there was not any agreement on this. Okay. What I did find was something kind of similar to what I would describe as like a best of list, like, or like a top 10 type of list multiple times. And so what this next section is going to talk about, they all varied in length and description and all that stuff. But what we're going to describe are some of the ones that are across kind of multiple lists. So I found that like, okay, this particular example was on 3 or 4 different lists that people kind of talk about in a way that is maybe a professional space and maybe gives some framework, but doesn't necessarily have any sort of empirical backing whatsoever. So I just want to kind of prime everybody for that piece here.
It does make sense that given that this is not a formal diagnosis, there would be relatively little consistent taxonomy dedicated to the sort of boundary conditions of what you might call types of sex addiction. Yeah. And so the borders that define this are nebulous. We find people that tend to come up with sort of their own categories as they see fit. So there are, as you said, a sort of few consistent types. So I guess we can go through those.
Yeah, the first one is a biological sex addict or addiction, which means that the person and anybody who is described as a biological sex addict has developed a dependency on some part of the biological process that involves sex. And in this space, what the key characteristic here is that it's purely the biological process. There is no sexual or psychological trauma involved with this person's kind of history. They just go, I really like this thing. I like this thing a lot. I like this thing so much it's causing me distress. That's kind of what the biological part of this is.
They have a dependency on having sex with biology.
Yeah. Those watch out textbooks.
There is abuse and neglect sex addicts, and it is reported that 80% of sex addicts have some sort of abuse or neglect in their past, which is sort of cited as the root cause of their then current addiction.
Right. There's also spiritual sex addicts, and these are folks that are described as having a condition that they aim to find spirituality through sex. Basically, they have a God-sized hole in their soul and in their body, and they're trying to fill that God-sized hole with something God-sized, if you will. But they're basically what they say here is they have a spiritual appetite that is not fulfilled through church or other forms of spiritual practices. And so they are looking for, quote, a spiritual connection in all the wrong places by just having a lot of sex for God.
Okay, sure.
All
right, so then the next one is a trauma-based sex addict. So this makes the argument that folks with trauma in their history seek to fantasize or aim to reenact that trauma in I guess a sort of sexual-based way.
Yes. There's also, I saw this one come up a lot, and it came up from this guy, Doug Weiss, who I looked up, and he was on Fox News and Oprah multiple times, so I don't know that he's the most trusted source on this.
Yeah.
We'll leave it at that. So he describes something called intimacy sex addicts. And basically, any of the behavior, the patterns that they engage in, the patterns of sex they engage with, or the dangerous sexual behaviors they engage in are intimacy seeking. They're seeking closeness. So they're trying to connect with people through that. And that's like the way that they find close connections with people. But they also include this subcategory of intimacy anorexia sex addicts, which basically says they are withholding intimacy from their partners and choosing to engage in risky sexual behavior elsewhere, maybe through infidelity, maybe through, some type of sex work industry type of service, and they give their intimacies elsewhere. They don't give it to their chosen partners.
That whole thing is very confusing to me.
Yeah.
For one thing, if you're an intimacy addict, then is specifically eschewing the opportunity for intimacy that you have cultivated already essentially is an oxymoron in relation to that hair splitting designation.
Sure.
And then like people who are not faithful to their partners being seen as essentially being intimacy anorexic seems like it's creating a category for the sake of having something fancy to call it.
Sure.
When it's sort of like, I think it's fairly common that people who are being unfaithful to their partners are also not doing a lot of sexual things with their partners, right? Like,
right.
Or other intimate things. That's maybe even part of the reason that they're sort of, they're moving on in the first place. So anyway, the last one that we have is mood disorder sex addicts. And this occurs when someone who already has an existing mood disorder may use sex as a form of self-medication, which also feels a little bit like hair splitting. In thinking about like any motivation that you could come up with that could be like I have bad thing, therefore I heal with sex, and then call that an individual thing. Again, it's just like it's getting to the point of everybody's got their own version of this disorder.
Right.
And then it's sort of like what's the point of even giving it a name anymore,
Yeah. It doesn't really make any sense to land on something that's like try to create something out of a thing that already exists. It's kind of like when you start seeing disorders split up into multiple disorders and you're like, you didn't need to do that because it's kind of all the same thing. It's just like different kind of indicators or characteristics of that. And that's kind of the way that I look at this is like, well, couldn't you, like let's say, you could pick any disorder that's got like a risky behavior inside of it. Like, could you not argue that like some type of sexual engagement that is risky is maybe part of the symptoms of that larger disorder? And I mean, that's, again, we're not even talking about like the problems with things like the DSM or like disorder and stuff like that in general. But like, I think that you're kind of like, people are kind of going, yeah, but it's its own thing. And it's like, actually, no, it's not its own thing. It's this thing specifically, or it's a set of behavior. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to split it all the way down this far.
It doesn't offer very much utility. There's very little in, I think, understanding the variables that contribute to any one of these things when it's just an infinite split and it just becomes completely like everything's got its own little category, but it only applies to like this one tiny little situation. I'm like, and that was part of the issue that we had with the DSM. Like the DSM, it was being every edition that came out, 1, 2, 3, 4, there's more and more and more and more diagnoses. Presumably, humans weren't coming up with more and more and more different ways to have mental health disorders. They were just slicing them up into smaller and smaller chunks, right?
Yeah.
And eventually DSM-5 did actually rein it in a little bit. And it started doing like these sort of spectrum disorders. Now, sex addiction isn't one of them, but if it was going to be, it would be like a spectrum of sexual disorder or diagnosis that would span all of these possible things. I think that would be my hypothesis about that.
Ultimately the problem is you're getting down to toothpicks for firewood, right? Like the log is already there. Yeah. Like just use the log. Why would you use 100 toothpicks when you could use one log? That's kind of my thought on that.
I like that. That's good. Splitting a log down into toothpicks for firewood, splitting a podcast into sections for ads. I think this whole time we've had a little bit of weighing in on the controversy on sex addiction and it's the difficulty in classifying this and understanding it and trying to bring some science to it. So let's break down the controversy a little bit.
You might be going, well, why is this even controversial to begin with? Well, it's for all of the obvious reasons that you think in terms of Western medicine and psychology and systems and all that stuff, right? Heteronormative comparisons are a problem. Puritan views on sex, big problem. Overgeneralization of treatment models, like taking drug addiction models and applying them to sexual behavior, not a very great way to do this. Americans needing to be number one in everything that includes creating disorders, because what we found is that sex addiction and sex disorders are most often, specifically sex addiction related things, are most often an American problem. Everything that everybody else is like, whatever, it's fine. Like, so it just sounds like it's more of a moral issue than anything else.
And, here's the thing. Compulsive sexual behavior has been observed in humans. It's also been observed in people under the influence and seen in animal models. It happens across many organisms and in different contexts. So I don't know. I think there is this sort of, as you said, are we pathologizing somewhat normal human experience? Are we creating a pathology by publicizing this where one may not have existed?
Yeah, and that's actually a big thing that we're going to kind of keep unpacking in this controversy. So now, when it comes to sex addiction in general, we've kind of already made the point that a lot of what has happened since the 80s is that a drug addiction model or a substance abuse model has been kind of overlaid with sex addiction. It's not a really good match. Actually, the drug addiction models are not very good for what are described as compulsive behaviors in general. Compulsion and addiction involve two unique mechanisms, behavioral mechanisms, different biological processes, all that stuff, different psychological processes that make them entirely different phenomenon. So you can't compare compulsion and addiction to being the same thing because they're not at all the same thing. By definition, they are very different things.
That is an important distinction. In some instances, sexual addiction has been classified as a form of obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD. In other cases, it's argued that the use of sex addiction is a means to, quote, project social stigmas onto patients, end quote. And this comes from Marty Klein, an American sex therapist, who specifically goes on to state that a disease model of sex addiction only works against the interests of healthy sexuality. And he goes on to say that, quote, the concept of sex addiction provides an excellent example of a model that is both sex negative and politically disastrous, end quote. So this is coming from someone who I think is in the space of specifically trying to support people who are dealing with sexual issues. And I think based on this, I would interpret his point to be that calling it sex addiction, or at least treating it as a sort of the disease model of addiction, is counterproductive.
Yeah, 100%. And when he brings up this idea of it being politically disastrous, it comes from, that's a values-based argument most often. Somebody who's described as being a sex addict is being described as being a sex addict or sexually deviant based on moral judgments or moral arguments.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, that are often found in, and usually some kind of spiritual, we'll just say a very popular spiritual book or two.
Fair.
But there's an additional layer to this controversy. That compulsive sexual behavior disorder that we mentioned in the ICD-11 earlier, not even based on current research.
I see.
Like, that's the big thing to kind of unpack that too, is like, people are talking about it, but there is no current research to support this behavioral disorder to even exist to begin with.
Okay, so we're waiting with bated breath, I think, to unpack as much as we possibly can the sort of scientific and behavioral view of what is going on here. So what is happening behaviorally in the space of sex compulsion or sexual addiction? A lot is potentially happening.
Yeah, I mean, you've got competing contingencies, right? You've got one thing is more reinforcing than the other. You've got powerful reinforcement systems or reward systems related to sex. You've got high risk and high reward types of behaviors. Some people really enjoy that high risk and the payoff that comes along with it. There's variable rewards. Sometimes sex with one person is better than sex with another person.
That is true.
That is true. There is inconsistent negative outcomes, right? When people say like, oh, if you do this, you're going to get pregnant or you're going to get an STI. And that doesn't happen as often as people think it does in some of those spaces. So there's a lot of things that influence, on top of the fact that, some types of sexual behavior are highly reinforcing for a lot of people. And so just the nature of sexual stimulation tends to be reinforcing in and of itself. So yeah. I think there's a lot to unpack within there just from a behavioral standpoint for why people will do this. And I'm not going to talk about this too much, but there is this issue of, I think what people are often talking about when they're talking about sex addiction is behavioral excess, right? They're worried that this behavior is happening above what would be, it's happening at a level that has become harmful for somebody. right? And that's
Yeah.
really kind of the concern. And that is a real thing that happens. Like somebody engages in some behavior that has become a detriment to them. That is
Yes.
true of any behavioral excess.
Yes.
I would not call behavioral excess an addiction, though.
Yes, exactly right. That's such a good point, is that like, and you look at the spectrum of like, there are going to be people who are on one end of the sex is just not reinforcing. They do not seek it out. They do not engage in it. It is not a part of the world that they live in, all the way to like sex is one of the most powerful reinforcers that they can have.
Right.
And so on that spectrum, you're going to have a wide variety of people who engage in it to various degrees that are largely modifiable, or at least specifically, I guess, affected by the variable of how motivating that is for them. And as you said, what happens then is there are plenty of behaviors that you may engage in that are at such a high level that they become, I think, first and foremost, and maybe most importantly for this conversation, they look like compulsive behaviors. They look like addictive behaviors. And I think you look at, I talk all the time about how much I love playing board games, and we even did an episode on board games, and I'm recommending board games, and like that I think has a lot of features with what looks like compulsion and addiction, in the sense that compared to like the average, my level of engagement with this is much higher than most people. Is it pathological? Is it inescapable? Could I like not quit it if I tried, And that's definitely not what's going on in this situation. And so I think that's probably the case here, is that there are people who they like it so much that they do it to excess. And they even probably engage in some above recommended levels of risk to get at that reinforcer.
Right.
But calling it an addiction is probably not the most productive way of conceptualizing that excess.
Right, exactly. It's likely that the increased sexual behavior, those things that we've been talking about, it looks like an addiction. It might be related to some other factors, right? So like if we want to kind of spin this thread and talk about mental health for a second, I think that the comment about self-medicating actually makes more sense if we talk about it less from like an addiction standpoint and more from like an avoidance behavior standpoint, right?
Yeah.
Like I engage in this behavior because, one, it's a better replacement than doing heroin. Two, I get to kind of escape for a little bit, not worry about kind of my problems for a while.
Totally. Yeah.
I get attention from another person. There's a lot of kind of like in the moment factors that apply to that. And I think, you could make the argument that like, sure, quote unquote, self-medicating is a decent way to look at it, or maybe a fine way to look at it, but still self-medicating would suggest that you are treating some kind of like ailment or disease, and not like an actual like behavioral concern or well-being issue.
There was a joke that someone made on a movie once that I think is actually probably reflects the exact reality that some people have or do experience, where they were like, we never fight because as soon as we're about to fight, we just have sex instead. So it's like, rather than have a real relationship where you get into the nitty gritty of having a relationship and sharing responsibilities in a life with someone, it's like as soon as things get tough, the escape for both of them, the avoidance for both of them is have sex. And so like, I think that is a good way to account for the circumstances view of behavior, which is like, what is going on for you now? What would be going on for you now if this wasn't available? What's going on for you when you're not doing this thing, right?
Right.
And so more likely sexual activity is stigmatized due to a few factors that then have people look at this as being a disorder, as being an addiction. And I think part of that is there's this misunderstanding and myth about sexuality that have been perpetrated from that, as you said, sort of puritan moral orientation to what is appropriate and what is not.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a big thing. So when we talk about sex addiction, most of the time what they are talking about are socially stigmatized types of, like concerns, right? So
yes, yeah.
Like just a couple examples, right? So misunderstanding or myths around sexuality that have been perpetuated, that is a reason why something around like a fetish or a paraphilia, like those types of things become part of the sex addiction issue because it's misunderstood. A dislike of non-heteronormative ideas of sexuality. I mean, if the United States isn't rife with that, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
The U.S. does not like gay couples is all, and which is a problem because like a lot of that's just a misunderstanding or just a dislike because of some kind of values that they've established around that.
Well, and then even like historically, the U.S. has had a problem with interracial couples. And I think even some people have expressed problems with that even contemporarily on some of the more sort of right-leaning discussions. But, I mentioned earlier that like there is an aspect of this definition of the behavioral disorder of compulsive sex that did not rule out sex work. And I think that that's almost intentional, because another misunderstanding here, or a stigmatization that has occurred, is this criminalization of sex work.
Yeah.
And we did an episode on sex work a long time ago that I think we were specifically trying to unpack like why this is not this thing that people need to be afraid of.
Right.
And how problematic it has been to stigmatize people who are in that workspace, who, for whatever reason that they're there, it kind of doesn't matter. Like we don't need to stigmatize people for working at McDonald's, for working at Walmart, for working at an oil company, or for being sex workers. Like we're all just trying to get by here,
Right.
And so treating any one of those as being more morally valid than another. And I would certainly rather hang out with a sex worker than an oil executive. But
100%.
right. So like that's just another thing to think about here, is that criminalization. And then I think all of this, I think, also is wrapped up in politics in a way. I think that people lean on these morality-based issues to try and fearmonger and to entice and coerce people into believing the same things. And there's this politicization of sexuality, and that's to cater to a voter base, to like tell them we're right, they're wrong. This is good, that's bad. And we're trying to say there's not bad. It's just, it's just normal human things that people do.
Right. As a case in point of like kind of the stigmatization or the politicizing of sexuality, let's talk about some disorders that existed. Nymphomania, which was like like people were really upset about that. Different, what they described as perversions. Or not too long ago, homosexuality.
Yeah, it's only been a few decades since that got removed.
That's what I'm saying. That was in the DSM. So as we kind of unpack that a little bit, it's worth just kind of going in and saying, yeah, there are times where sometimes mental health concerns, quote unquote concerns, or something that is socially maybe disliked by a lot of people, it gets pathologized, it gets put into some medical journal, and now it gets treated as if it were an actual problem when it's not. And that's actually, you're seeing that happen right now with the trans community and gender identity. I mean, we're
definitely
watching that unfold right now before your very eyes as we watch people politicize trans folks. We have turned their stories into what some people will say medical problems or mental health problems, and they've stigmatized it and tried to medicalize it and turn it into something that's treatable versus something that requires support, which is every human being that exists needs some level of support that meets their current needs.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to watch from an objective standpoint. It's infuriating to watch from an emotional standpoint because people just misunderstand it so much.
And like a scientific standpoint.
Yeah, exactly.
It's, I almost blew past this too, because it's infuriating that we have to pause for ads.
Oh,
Okay, so there's a couple of points that I think we need to make. And let's talk about, I think, treatment for this, because there are people, I think one thing that I don't want to have people walk away from this is saying that nobody suffers from a behavioral excess of sexuality. That's not our point. That's not what we're saying. That might be a thing that happens, and certainly some people do have an excess, even to the point where they would like that excess to be reduced. And so I think that that's a very real experience that some people have. Treatment does exist related to concerns around this sort of idea of quote-unquote sexual addiction, but mostly entail interventions around other potential causal factors because, as we've said, likely this is a behavioral excess occurring in the context of some other issue worth unpacking. This is family therapy, couples therapy, CBT, DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, sex education, etc. These are all possible pathways to help increase knowledge around this behavior, to demystify the concept of sexuality, and to provide language and skills around healthy sexual behavior patterns that are relevant to the person, rather than being based on these sort of social stigmas and heteronormative platonic norms that set an unnecessary, impractical, and often unrealistic expectation and standard for people.
yeah. And I think one of the ultimate questions we're trying to ask is whether or not this exists. And I think that to me, when I land on this and I think about kind of the scientific view, we could make the argument that no, sex addiction does not exist. Sex addiction is the symptom of social and political influence for things that people misunderstand or dislike, right? But that does not mean that people are not impacted by behaviors in this space, right? You'll hear people talk about porn addiction and how that has influenced their life. And is it an addiction? Maybe not so much, but there is a behavioral excess issue that is definitely impacting them. Folks that have, like we mentioned earlier in the episode from our Alcoholics Anonymous, serial infidelity, right? Mm-hmm. This issue of people going out and engaging in these behaviors that are damaging to their relationships and stuff. And so, like, are people impacted by sexuality related behaviors that are risky behaviors? Yes, absolutely. I don't think that the addiction model is the way to look at it. And there's nothing in the evidence that supports using an addiction model to not only evaluate, but treat this type of concern that somebody might bring to a therapeutic environment.
Yeah, very good point. I want to make sure also that I leave with, I think we have some other sort of interesting things to unpack a little bit before we wrap this up, but I want to make sure that we have more or less come out in a pretty sex positive way on this show multiple times, and I think including this discussion in this episode today. And I want to always make sure I'm really clear with people understanding we draw a line at consent.
Yeah.
Rape does not qualify in this.
Right.
Child molestation does not qualify in this. Animal abuse, sexual animal abuse does not qualify in this. These are not people who provided or can provide consent in these spaces. Right. So we are not in any way advocating that people do whatever they want with anybody at any time. We are only advocating for people who are engaging in this in a way where there is consent and it can be done safely. And that can be at a much higher rate than what you might expect from average. Can be a safe, healthy, perfectly fine way to orient to that. Again, as long as there's little harm and there is consent.
Right.
It's very easy, I think, for people to point to people who advocate for moving away from the sort of platonic heteronormative sexual structure that exists and say, these are the child molestation, they're all in favor of that sort of thing and these rapists and whatnot. And I think we're really clearly not at all. We're very anti any kind of abuse to anybody, harm, trauma, anything is bad. I think we would specifically say don't do those things. And I think that arguably taking the sex addiction angle can cause sort of harm and trauma. But the important line to draw here is that we draw the line at consent. Children and animal and unwilling participants do not and cannot consent. Therefore, they do not qualify as that kind of behavior being considered acceptable in any way, shape, or form.
Right. Absolutely. Okay, so there's a couple other things I wanted to add underneath this that I thought were really fun as I was researching this. One is that terms like love addiction were actually used a lot in early pornography as a means to market porn in a less scandalous manner. So they would basically describe something as oh, they've got a love addiction. And then that was some of the the pulp magazines and stuff that would go out at the time.
That is such a good euphemism. I love that.
Right.
Oh man. And that you'd say that and it'd be the sort of raised eyebrows, love addiction.
Love addiction.
Picking up what I'm laying down.
Yep. Yep. Exactly.
Evidently, Michael Douglas and Rob Lowe were both deemed sex addicts when they entered rehab in the past. So why bring them up here? Well, some consider them the first sort of quote-unquote celebrity sex addicts. Mm-hmm. However, this was a media issue. And why did they both going into rehab? Alcohol.
Yeah. They did not go for sex addiction. They went to rehab, and the media was like, they're sex addicts. It's no, they went for alcohol. Yeah. That's why they went, and it got turned into this big thing. So I thought that was really fascinating that they were considered the first celebrity sex addicts, but it had nothing to do with sex addiction at all.
All right. Hey, I think we're going to be on the shorter end of episodes for the series of addiction we've been doing. Do you have anything else to add or anything we need to say before? I think we've done a really good job, I think, of couching our sort of main points inside of this discussion as it's played out. But I definitely want to have you have the sort of the final monologue, if you will, of what people need to know before they leave this discussion.
Yeah. Where I would land on this is that does excessive sexual behavior impact people? Yes. Is it an addiction? I would argue no, based on the current field that we've got. Do people need help around kind of navigating these conversations and navigating these behaviors? Absolutely, because these behaviors are very impactful for people. And so I definitely think if you are curious or unsure or need support, then please seek the appropriate folks that can help, because they will help guide you around healthier behavioral patterns around that. But otherwise, I think that calling it a disease or an addiction is not quite where we need to be with this. I think a lot of we've kind of already said it, but I think a lot of it's kind of misunderstood stuff.
That's fair. I think that's a great point to end on. I don't think I could expand on that any better.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that.
All right. If you would like to write in and tell us about your sex addiction or your other addictions or anything else that we said on here, or just to tell us how much you like listening to our podcast, we love hearing that stuff. You can reach us directly by emailing us at info@wwd.podcast.com. You can also reach us on the other social media platforms. And of course, leave us a rating and review and share us with a friend. We like to actually close with some recommendations in case you're joining us for the first time. But before we get to those recommendations, I want to make sure that, as I said, you can support us on Patreon. When you do that, there's all kinds of things you might get depending on the level at which you sign up, all kinds of perks and benefits, and it really helps us just keep being a show.
Yeah.
So like you get something, we get something. There's a win-win situation here. If you're interested and available and want to help us out, you can jump over to Patreon. We've got this lovely group of people that we really enjoy having around, and they're just so generous and kind that's even an option. And that includes Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, Ashley, Kiara, Christy, and Michelle. Thank you all so much for your continued support.
Yes, we love you so much. Like so much.
Of course, thank you to my team who really make this happen. Writing and fact checking from Shane, Jess, and myself. We've got editing and audio production from Justin, and our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson. Is there anything that I left out or anything that you would like to add before we move to our recommendations?
No.
Okay, let's recommend some things.
Yay! Recommendations.
All right, I am recommending a TV show. Now, to be fair, I have not finished watching this TV show yet. And it is so good at the point that I've gotten to that I'm like, there's almost no way in my mind that they could even mess it up. And it is completely available to, like, the whole thing's available to stream. And this is the new TV show Fallout, which is streaming on Amazon or Amazon Prime. And it is based off of just a legendary series of games by the same name there's been various Fallouts. There's even a board game that was developed
Nice.
From the video game. These are all sort of computer-based video games. And then I think they're also on like Xbox or something. I don't know. Anyway, it's a video game.
Yes.
And they've developed this TV show. And I would say historically video game-based properties were not very good.
True.
And they have started to get very, very good.
Uh-huh.
So this is written directed by Jonathan Nolan. The last name may sound familiar. He's the brother of Christopher Nolan. Oh. And man, I am just loving this show. I mean, I'm excited to finish it. And it's a little premature for me to jump the gun and make the recommendation, but I'm just like, it's so good. What the hell? Check out Fallout.
I love that. I've heard it's actually really, really good from people who like the game too.
Yeah, definitely a lot of Easter eggs in there. And I know enough to recognize that they're Easter eggs. I don't know enough to recognize what they all are.
Sure.
But some of the leads in this, Ella Purnell and Walton Goggins, who I think is one of those actors who's been in everything, and then you don't really recognize him. Or I mean, you recognize him, but you're like, wait a minute, was he in that? And he's just been in a lot of stuff, and he actually gets to have a more leading role in this. And he's just fantastic. He was an Ant-Man and the Wasp as the sort of villain in that. So anyway, it's really good.
I'm so glad it's good. I'm so glad you're enjoying that.
Yeah.
Mine's a book. I'm also not done with this book. I'm about halfway through, but I am loving this journey. I've had this book for 20 years and never picked it up to read it.
Wow.
It's just one of those things where it's like, I borrowed it forever and finally I'm getting around to reading it.
It's the Bible.
It's the Bible. I'm just, oh man, like the earth came from nothing and now it's something, and there's apples and there's snakes. Oh man, it's a wild time.
Riveting.
I heard there's dragons at some point. So the book I'm actually reading is Dracula by Bram Stoker. Have you ever read Dracula?
I actually never have. I've always wanted to. I have it, probably have had it just as long as you, and just never made time for it. So I should.
You know what? It's really great. And it's definitely different than I thought. So I went in kind of like, knowing a little bit about Dracula's lore, like, about Renfield, and about like he drinks blood, and that he hates garlic and stuff like that.
Sure.
And that Van Helsing is like kind of the Van Helsing family is like the vampire hunter, monster hunter family that exists in that world. But man, it is so engaging because you think that like I personally have a hard time kind of picking up older literature and going like, because I have to like really think about how something is written and like the languaging around stuff to like follow along, and it's just so different than literature today.
Yeah,
which it's not anything other than it's just a difference of reading. But this is written as an epistolary. And it's really cool. And for those of you who don't know what an epistolary is, the entire story is told through letters and journals.
Oh, okay.
There's not like a narrator, like that is like a dedicated narrator that's got like an omnipotent kind of view of everything. It is literally just you're reading captain's logs from ships and diary entries and letters to friends. And it's telling the story of like Dracula kind of coming into London from Transylvania and kind of how he arrives. And man, it is done so well, and it like happens quickly. Like within the first 50 pages, you've got wolves and you've got bloodsucking and you've got and then you've got Renfield shows up, and it happens pretty quickly, and it's a really great read. I'm about halfway through, and I am absolutely loving it.
If I recall correctly, the book World War Z was actually written as that epistolary is what it was called.
Yeah, World War Z is written like that too. Yeah.
And man, I thought that was so cool and so creative. Man, you really, because this is one that I know a lot of people have spoken highly of, that has been on a lot of people's like sort of top 100 or top 10 even favorite books. And I've always thought like, oh yeah, like I like classics. I like, sort of the well-respected old literature. And you really, I think, have enticed me to want to check this out. So that's really good to hear.
I went into Frankenstein with kind of the same viewpoint and just loved that, like fell in love with that. And I think I'm having the same kind of experience around this one. So it's been really cool.
Cool. All right. Fallout for you people, video gamers in particular, but anyone really interested in watching really good TV. Dracula for you readers by Bram Stoker, who are interested in picking up the classics and then really being glad that you did.
Yeah.
Anyway, that is the episode. I think that's all we have to say. So thank you so much for listening. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.